Good morning, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the 11th Gulf Intelligence UAE Energy Virtual Forum, where we will be discussing the overall theme of the event, the energy outlook for the year ahead. My name is 𝖤𝖵𝘁'𝘀. I'm the CEO Middle East for 𝖤𝖵𝘁 Global Commodities in Dubai, and I'll be your facilitator for this lecture. This session will last for about 20 minutes, 10 minutes of which will be this lecture, and then there will be 10 minutes at the end for question and answers through the chat function on your screen, which I would like to encourage all of you to use. Without further delay, it is my pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Axel Wiedfeldt, who is our CEO of Hydrogen at 𝖤𝖵𝘁, and he will give this 10-minute lecture on what actions must be taken in 2021 to establish a robust hydrogen market within the decade. Axel, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John. Well, the biggest question of our time is the need to meet growing energy demand while making huge reductions in carbon emissions. And I believe it's not enough to pose that power generation from renewables alone will make the difference. This strategy would still leave the problem unresolved for many growing areas of the economy that currently depend on carbon-emitting fuels. For example, heavy industry and transportation sectors. Hydrogen is the only fuel that can decarbonize most sectors. It can be produced where conditions are technically and economically favorable. It can be stored in large quantities and transported across continents. Just as oil was crucial to building a new world economy in the 19th and 20th century, I genuinely believe hydrogen will provide the base for a whole new world of jobs and growth in the 21st century. So, of course, there are some predictions and forecasts about future hydrogen demand. And in a nutshell, most of them suggest that probably the consumption of hydrogen will more than triple within the next 30 years. So the question is, who is going to use this hydrogen? Currently, it's mainly the refining industry and the transportation sector, and most likely it's also the industry sector using hydrogen a lot more. It will also be used for the production of synfuels and last but not least for ammonia production. So what do I mean by hydrogen production? Obviously, there is a certain color code. As of today, most of the hydrogen is produced by methane and using oil. So that's fossil hydrogen. We also call it gray hydrogen. I believe we will start this year even more, and within the next decades, to produce also green hydrogen and blue hydrogen. So what do I mean by that? Green hydrogen is using hydrogen and producing it by electrolysis, which means we would use renewable energies to produce this hydrogen. And blue hydrogen, it's just a combination of traditional hydrogen combined with carbon capture storage or carbon capture usage. So what would be important as a next step then to enter this new economy and to produce a lot more of this hydrogen? As a next step, I believe it is important that companies across the globe form corporations, and we are certainly ready to do so. In the long run, I believe a global commodity market for clean hydrogen will develop, driven by regions with large potential for low-cost renewables. And there, the Middle East is a superb example with perfect irradiation and sometimes also perfect load factors for wind. So the Middle East and Northern Africa, amongst others, have promising hydrogen production locations, and nevertheless there are certain challenges which would have to be overcome within the next years and within the next decade. Challenge for the Middle East might be the use of demineralized water for electrolysis, and we all know that water is a scarce resource in the Middle East. Given the large distances to consumption centers, for example, in Europe, hydrogen transportation, either liquid hydrogen or via ammonia or via organic carriers, seems the most realistic option compared to electricity transport. There is also evidence that this is far cheaper than any further electricity transport by just transporting directly hydrogen in a gaseous or liquid form. So our company, Uniper, we're well prepared to enter into the stage. We have decades of experience in the natural gas sector, and undoubtedly also first experience in hydrogen. So we have developed pilot plants in the past, in the last 10 years, and we are now following certain scheme to develop various projects in Europe, and are very open also to do that in other regions, for example, the Middle East. I believe hydrogen is key to climate neutrality. As explained, electrification alone cannot achieve climate goals. I think as a next step, it would certainly be industrial sectors and industrial customers making use of more hydrogen, also the transportation sector. And what we certainly need is legislative actions. We have certain stimulus packages across the globe as a consequence of this pandemic situation, and also to boost the economy. And these stimulus packages, they also target clean hydrogen. What would have to be done within the next years is clearly to transpose these packages, these policies and strategies into legislation and into detailed legislative procedures, so that companies can make use of that and that we can boost the economy. Because for the moment, hydrogen is not yet economically viable. We talk green hydrogen or blue hydrogen, which means that the industry has to further develop projects. We have to scale up hydrogen, because currently the projects for green hydrogen and blue hydrogen are rarely at a, mostly at a small scale. So with scaling up these projects, we will certainly achieve lower production costs. And in parallel, we need the political and the regulatory support to develop those projects and the scheme, and to be competitive to traditional gray hydrogen. So current projects envisage multi-megawatt electrolyzers and an injection of green hydrogen into also underground storage facilities, which means we also have to resolve the issue of transportation, either via pipeline or via ship. And we would then have to come into a scheme where we also commercialize hydrogen. And I believe Uniper's global origination team is well positioned to commercialize hydrogen activities, and so are a lot of other companies. So this combination of developing the assets, developing the technology, finding a political and regulatory scheme, combined with the cooperation of various parties across continents, and also enter into an import and export scheme similar to the natural gas and the LNG business. I think that is key for 2021 and for the years to come, because it's clearly more what I described, what can be achieved just in 1 year. It's probably a scheme for 10 years. Over to you, John.
Axel, thanks very much indeed. So look, ladies and gentlemen across the world, we have the opportunity to ask Axel your questions. So while I'm looking at the chat room, and I'll be picking off questions from that, Axel, perhaps I can ask you a couple of questions. You've actually answered one of the questions that I was going to put to you, and that was how does the Middle East fit into this new green hydrogen industry? And of course, you explained that fairly clearly. In the next 15 years, I mean, all of our companies at the moment are looking at how to develop more than pilot scale projects. We need to get into scalable projects. Mm-hmm. So what do you see as an overview for the next 15 years, for instance?
Well, I believe that we will develop hydrogen in phases. I think the next 5 years, realistically, we will look at semi-commercial projects, to be developed mostly in the scale, probably between 10 and 100 megawatt installations. And we will start also commercialize sales activities for hydrogen based on long-term supply partnerships, dedicated supply partnerships for hydrogen. And in parallel, we will shape the regulatory schemes and secure also political subsidies. Then if we further look between 2025 and 2030, I'm quite confident that we will see facilities for hydrogen at a larger scale. So then clearly the gigawatt scale is absolutely realistic, and we should have the ambition to develop facilities in such scale. In particular, if we are discussing, and that's probably relevant for the Middle East now as well, if we are discussing export projects, then this only makes sense if we are talking larger scale facilities. And along with that, there will be an emerging sales business, and a small spot market will develop with a stabilized regulation. And I believe post 2030, we will have growing scale beyond the gigawatt facilities via expanding to all relevant sectors and regions. We will see significant free volumes and arbitrage opportunities. And I genuinely believe that in future, we will supply and trade hydrogen in a similar manner we do it today with natural gas and with LNG. But it will take some time until we really develop this liquid market for hydrogen globally.
Thanks very much. Look, we've got a lot of interesting questions coming in. One from 𝖪𝗔𝖷𝖫𝖫. He's asking what level of subsidy and government support is needed to make the hydrogen industry viable. Clearly, at the moment, making investments into an industry that might not give terribly good rates of return is going to need subsidy and support. How do you see those subsidies manifesting?
Yeah, that's a very good and also tricky question. It depends very much on the jurisdiction, because in some countries we have more hurdles than in others. As a rule of thumb, probably hydrogen, the production costs for green hydrogen are probably double as high as for gray hydrogen. Now it depends on the country. For example, in Germany, where I'm coming from, we still had the issue of having to pay renewable levies for hydrogen. That has to be abolished. Some countries develop a scheme, contract for differences, which means that the difference between the production of green hydrogen and the traditional hydrogen, that this is paid for as kind of a subsidy and support scheme, which I believe is just an intelligent solution. And it could also be subsidies directly for the capital expenditures, because that clearly also is some money and large investments you have to take for hydrogen. If you look at electrolysis, you see, if you look at the numbers and the business model, that the price of electricity is a dominant factor, and consequently also in the long run, clearly the advantage for those countries with cheap renewables. So that would be definitely a winning factor. But after all, we need the determination and the motivation of companies also to invest into the future and to take into account that for the next years, the return will probably be pretty low despite additional subsidies.
Let me just expand on that. And we have the German Energy Agency, which is sort of very active in this space at the moment. How do you see them applying themselves to projects abroad? And the reason I ask this is Germany has a huge requirement for hydrogen that it's not going to be able to produce itself domestically. So it's going to need to import hydrogen. So do you see relationships between entities like the German Energy Agency and developing companies like our own as important globally?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Yeah, as you rightly point out, in Western Europe, probably we'll have to import more than 50% of the hydrogen demand, and which is not a problem because we are very much used to it, given that oil and natural gas we are also importing in huge amounts. And what I can see that both agencies and associations such as DINA, but also individual companies, they are reaching out to cooperate. And I think it makes a lot of sense to use existing corporations we have got to extend them to hydrogen. And there, the Middle East is a good example. Also, Northern Africa might be good, good regions. Clearly, if you look at the landscape for importing into Europe, it's also discussed to use Southern America and Australia, that on the one hand makes a lot of sense. On the other hand, I'm not sure whether this is really the first step, given the long distances of those countries.
Okay, I'm going to touch on a question from Янис Мардell. Янис is asking, is there a scope for instance, low emission LNG to be the source of some blue hydrogen, perhaps in Europe and Asia? We sit at the end of some very large pipelines from neighboring countries, and of course that's also a discussion that we have. And Янис is following that up as well with when do we see the export of liquid hydrogen a reality, as opposed to these chemical carriers that we're currently considering?
Yes, well, these are two questions. First of all, I acknowledge that there is clean LNG being developed, and certainly that can be part of the solution. What we have to do then still, given this decarbonization scheme and the carbon neutrality ambitions of companies such as ourselves, we would have to find a solution for that one. So there are discussions about storing CO2 in Europe, and that of course would have to be resolved. The best carrier to transport hydrogen, whether it's liquid hydrogen or organic carriers, I think there are a lot of assessments and pre-studies being developed as we speak. For the moment, most of those consultants and studies suggest that organic carriers and ammonia transportation would be cheaper than liquid hydrogen. Nevertheless, I think that's still to be seen, and we'll probably also see various forms of carriers depending on the demand side. If there is a customer asking for, just use an example, ammonia, then the ammonia transportation certainly makes sense. If the customer doesn't need ammonia, then it's the question whether we would have to, or whether it's meaningful to convert hydrogen into ammonia for transportation and then crack it back into hydrogen. So
all right, so we have just a short time left, but I wanted to get this question in from Abhishek, and I won't be running over time, or at least not by a few seconds. How do you see the challenges for the use of hydrogen in the maritime industry? If you could make your answer fairly short. Yes,
I think it's a very good idea. Yeah, because in the maritime industry, clearly electrification is not an option, and more decarbonization is also relevant for the maritime industry, and consequently hydrogen, then perhaps in a liquid form to have higher energy density would make a lot of sense in the future, I believe.
All right, well look, we're very much paying attention to time. I'm afraid that's all we have time for in this session, as this global forum continues its journey across the world. I'd like to thank you, Axel, for your interesting insights, and for the attendees and questions that came from our colleagues around the world. We look forward to seeing you shortly in the plenary session of the forum, and we thank you all from Gulf Intelligence and UNIPER. Thank you very much indeed.